tonight's workshop. My name is Hannah Newell. I'm an environmental educator with Pierce County, and welcome to the Edible Gardens workshop on container gardening. This is a collaboration between Harvest Pierce County, Pierce Conservation District, and Pierce County environmental educators. Let's see. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge the fact that we're all gardening and cultivating plants on the lands of the Puyallup, Nisqually, Squaxin Island, and Muckleshoot people. They have and continue to be stewards, caretakers, activists, and family with the land that we all live. Often they are the voice for the more than human world, and the land practices that they have implemented since time immemorial have supported the beauty of this land and what many land management groups are realizing they need to return to in order to revitalize the land that has been damaged through colonization and industrial revolution. I also want to take a moment to recognize the many Black and brown bodies that have suffered to cultivate farmlands through forced enslavement and the continued barriers that people face in relation to growing food.
Sometimes we don't get the best.
Today, I hope to give you all tools to feel empowered to grow your own food in the space that you have available in a way that best fits your need. This practice should be accessible to all, and container gardening is a great way to open those doors. Ryan, are we recording?
Yes.
Great. Just wanted to make sure. All right. So this is a great tool to kind of check out what native land you're on. Currently, this is just the picture of the Puget Sound area, including the Olympic Peninsula, but it does go further out to other parts of the United States, to other parts of the world. And this is native-land.ca. This is a great tool for when you're traveling, just to understand whose land you're on and a little bit about the people who you're visiting. And as I said, this is part of the Edible Gardens series. We had a number of workshops that happened previously to this one. We're in our containers one. We had our workshop in person on Saturday, and then this is our Zoom version. And I'm just curious if a show of hands, or you can put into the chat if you attended any of the other workshops from the Edible Garden series so far. Oops. Great, so there's a number of other workshops coming up, so feel free to check them out. They're all on the website where you registered for this session, including soil coming up, your summer garden. We have a garden summit that will have a lot of in-person activities and booths and just a lot of information all at once. If you're interested in any sort of bug that's either entering your garden welcomingly or not a welcome visitor, feel free to check that session out, as well as a fall and winter garden. We have a composting session, seed saving, and putting your garden to bed. So you really get to see that full circle of gardening throughout the seasons. So what is container gardening? It can be a lot of things. In just simple terms, it is growing food or growing things inside of a container. That doesn't necessarily have to be a pot. It can be a tire, it can be a plastic bag, it can be many different things. It doesn't necessarily have to be food, but just growing something inside of a container. This video that I'm going to show just a portion of is something that I found on Instagram that was really inspiring to me when I started growing in my different apartment locations. Now, this person does have a full-scale garden where he grows in the ground and also in pots, but he uses a very small space to produce a lot of food for himself. And he's located in the UK, is Italian, so he has a little bit of an accent, but it's a really cool video just to kind of inspire you and get you starting to think about how creative you can be with the containers that you use. Oops.
Hannah, you might have to reshare and put the click the audio button.
Gotcha. Sorry about that.
I've done that many times.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Let's go back.
How you doing, guys? It's Alessandro here from Spicy Moustache with some new tips in order to help you creating your own green area, indoor or outdoor, following the principle of do as nature does. Gardening in a small space could be much more productive per square meter than a
And
large.
it's not showing the full
The
presentation.
reason is that you need to be more creative and fit as
It's
many
not
plants as
showing
you
the
can.
presentation.
It's showing it, but in like the where it has the next slide on the others on the right side.
Oh,
So it's not full screen.
I'll get it eventually.
There you go.
Okay. Let me know if there's any other issues.
To use the
Will do.
full potential of your growing space. Also, it's a great way to master how to grow certain plants from seed to harvest, and it will make it much easier one day to scale up to a bigger space. So dig up that like button, and today I'll share with you 10 of my best tips to start growing your own food in a small space. First thing that I would like to recommend is to recycle as many materials as you can. You can make loads of DIY projects and you reduce your wastage by reusing all materials. If you live in a city like myself, it's a good idea to just have a walk around and collect materials that people don't use, or ask your neighbors to give you some old materials. I managed to create many different projects using secondhand materials in my garden, like a fire pit thanks to some old bricks that were left over from one of my neighbors, but also a bench by repurposing some old flooring boards that I found on another neighbor's house. And I also made some planters out of some old tires, and I managed to create 2 vertical gardens by simply using plastic bottles. Just a quick tip: if you're using old tires, remember to line the inside of the tires with another material so you won't have chemical leakage inside your soil. Making your own compost will have a great impact on your finances and benefits for your garden. By using a simple barrel like mine, you could potentially make enough compost to cover all your pots and raised beds for the whole season. Also, it's a great sustainable way to reduce the amount of food scraps that you chuck away daily. My compost bin is sitting on a concrete floor, and contrary to the common beliefs, it doesn't smell at all. This means that you could have this on your patio, small garden or balcony. You just need to have the right ratio of carbon, so dry things, and nitrogen, green things, and your compost will smell great. I made a video all about how to transform a barrel like this one into a compost bin in a few easy steps. I mentioned.
I'm going to stop it there because it goes on for quite a while, but he has a lot of really cool tips on how to garden in small spaces, which many people, when they're approaching container gardening, have space constraints. So that it's a cool way of thinking about different forms of gardening and achieving a large volume of food growth in a smaller space. So I'm going to turn it over to you again, and in the chat, go ahead and type in why you are interested in container gardening. What is bringing you to this new form of gardening, or maybe it's something that's continued to bring you to this form of gardening? Okay, so Molly said, I'm trying to grow all my family's fruit and vegetables in a fairly small space. I don't garden and thought this would be a great way to start. I'm new to the Pacific Northwest and new house and yard, want to try stuff out before making big firm changes, totally. Although my property is nearly an acre in size, I have very little sun because of my neighbor's towering trees. Managed to do a little in 2 oval stock tanks over the past 3 years. Great. Tips on what plants work best in containers. You have some raised beds, but hopefully learning to take care of the soil, make the best of the space. Yeah. Want to grow veggies and herbs and introduce gardening with my kiddo. That is great. We had someone on Saturday who brought their kid to the session, which was really cool to see. Small space, not much sun, and would like to start growing some food. Yep. Want to add dimension to go vertical, plus more space to grow plants. Totally. So some of the things that have attracted me to container gardening and are also what you all have been mentioning is accessibility. Container gardens can be at a different height, meaning you don't have to necessarily bend over as much or crouch down. It's not digging or tilling, making it a little easier to plant things in containers and maintain them over the course of the season. You can manage the soil. If any of you live in the Puyallup Valley or different areas around Pierce County have varying soil types, some of them not as great to plant in. And it's much easier to have a container where you create the soil, you choose the soil that you put inside of it, and you know exactly what is in it.
Oh,
It's a
Hannah, can I stop for a second? There was one question that kind of tied into that when you said that. Where to go? Something is in my soil that makes my root veggies grow lumps.
Okay.
And it made me think of the managed soil.
Yeah, so thinking about lots of rocks, roots, things like that are just present in our soil, in our yards, it's just part of growing in the ground. But if you're able to plant in containers, you can totally make sure that there are no rocks or roots inside of your soil, making it nice and fresh and fluffy for those root veggies to grow perfectly straight or round, whichever one you're growing. Container gardening is also low commitment. So if you're new to container gardening, you're new to the area, I saw someone else in the chat say that, it is low commitment. You can try things out, and if it doesn't work out like you thought it would, that's also okay. It's much more approachable than tilling up a whole area of your yard and really dedicating that to growing food. You can try things out in pots, and if you like them and if you have the space available, you can plant them in the ground. And if you're moving apartment to apartment like I was previously, you can move those pots with you, which I always loved because I never wanted to leave behind the plants that I started growing. Again, no digging or tilling, making it much easier to get started and also to maintain. Can also be weed free. As you're choosing the soil, you know what's going into the soil. Sometimes if you buy potting soil from like home stores, they might have some weeds in them already, but typically they are fairly weed free. The only time that I had a really big weed problem in my container gardening was when I was gardening on a rooftop and we had lots of birds flying over, dropping seeds and pooping onto the roof, and that would end up in our containers. And I saw lots of different plants somehow showing up in my chamomile plants and other plants that I had. Along with the low commitment, it's fairly inexpensive to start, especially if you're reusing materials that you either find or come across. There's lots of like Craigslist and buy nothing place platforms are great place to find free materials to start your container gardening from. Again, container location. You can move your container. If you have an area of your yard that's super sunny or an area on your patio that's super sunny, and your plant is not needing as much sun, it's not a tomato, it's not necessarily a sun-loving plant, you can move it into a shadier spot. Or if you have the opposite, you're growing tomatoes and you have one shady area that started off as a sunny area, but then it moved, you can move that container to get to that sunnier spot and take advantage of that full growing season that you need for tomatoes. You can also create plant protection pretty easily. It's much easier to put a fabric over a potted plant than it is over yards of growing space in the ground, as well as making little greenhouses out of plastic or even small glasses when you're just starting your sprouts. Those are easy ways to protect your plant and also start your growing season early for your containers. Season extension, just what I was saying. Putting plastic or glass over those seedlings to really get them started before you plant them into your container is a really easy way to start your starts now, and then you can have them growing in your container and continually maintaining that rotation of crops throughout the season. But there are some factors to consider with container gardening, and I've seen a couple of people in chat dropping in some things that they've run into or some challenges that they've faced with container gardening. So some factors that we're going to go over right now are location, watering, soil, fertilizers, and nutrients. So when you're thinking about location, you want to think about sun exposure. What's the orientation that you have to the sun? How long is your exposure? Typically 6 to 8 hours of full sun is ideal for most veggies. And you want to think about the orientation of your area and the various things that could either block or increase sunlight, wind, or rain. So if you have a shady patio, you can put up reflective material, if you have a mirror or something like that, to bring more light into your area. You want to use established infrastructure to maximize plant growth. So for example, tomatoes really like heat. Think to yourself, do I have an area that has a concrete wall or a rock bed that you can place them on? That will maximize the heat in the area for the plant to really thrive off of and keep that growing season as long as it needs for those tomatoes to get ripe and good. There's also apps that can help you track the sunlight. Sunseeker is one of them, and it can help you plan where to locate your plants depending on their need. There's a number of other free online applications that help you track the sun. You can also purchase meters to measure sunlight. And then you want to think about microclimates. They can really matter, and especially with containers, because containers are somewhat exposed to the elements more than in the ground. And you want to take advantage of black plastic pots that can increase the heat inside of your plant, or clay pots that can, terracotta pots that can really pull the water out and keep your plant a little bit more dry if that is what you're needing. You also want to have good circulation amongst your plants. So not a huge windstorm coming through, but definitely some sort of breeze to help your plants breathe. Okay. So watering. This is the #1 challenge with container gardening because you have so many different things to water, especially if you're kind of putting your containers in a lot of different areas. And it's really typical to overwater your containers because if you're doing it so frequently and you're not really aware of how moist your soil is, it can be common to just overwater them on accident, especially when you're using different container types. So when you're thinking about watering in a container, you need something that is well draining. So a container that has holes. If you already have a container or you just bought one and you realize they don't have holes in them, drill them in if you're able to. If you're not, you can actually put a pot within a pot. So if you really like that pot that doesn't have holes in it, take another smaller pot that has holes in it and just place it inside of that more decorative pot. And that can allow you to have that good look that you're going for and use that pot that you just bought without holes, but still allow drainage to happen inside of the other pot. So some different ways of watering are self-watering systems, drip systems, and hand watering. So terracotta pots can, like I mentioned briefly, that they pull water out, they leach water really easily, which is a really great system for when you're wanting to water your plant. So you can actually dig a hole inside of your container. If you have a larger container, you can put one of these vessels inside of the soil, fill the vessel with water, and it'll leach water out into the container, watering your plant on its own. This is a self-watering system. You can buy these vessels online, but you can also just use a terracotta pot that you have on hand by just flipping it over and putting it into the soil that way. This is an example of another self-watering system where they're using a plastic bottle here. They just cut it off in half and then flipped it into the bottom of it. You fill the bottom with water and have a stream going from the soil into the water. And the roots of the plant will actually pull the water up through the soil to feed the water, to feed the plant the water it needs. This is another version of a cache pot where you have a section below that's cut off from the soil that you fill with water using the plastic bottle that's in the center. You pour the water into the water bottle, it goes and holds down into that lower chamber, and then will be pulled up by the soil and the roots as the plant needs it. Again, another version. This is a drip system though, where they're using a plastic bottle. You can use a glass bottle as well. And they poke a hole into the lid of the bottle and put in a skewer or a toothpick of some sort, fill the bottle with water, and then just place it inside of the container, and it'll drip water at a slow rate for the watering of the plant. This is a great system if you're like, oh, I'm going to be gone for a week or two, and I want to make sure that my plants get watered, but I don't have anyone to come water them. So this could be an option for that if you're going on a vacation or something. This is a more advanced drip system where you can buy irrigation lines from a store and set those up on like a daisy chain sort of system. And then this version, I've seen a lot of these recently. They're just like IV bags basically with a small drip system going into the plant, one drip at a time, and you can control the flow of that water too. I've seen these made as well with plastic bottles and tubing. It really just depends on what you have on hand. And then hand watering. This is probably the most common way of watering container gardens, but it is also the most time intensive and potentially labor intensive. If you don't have a soaker hose and you're using a watering can to water your containers, you're having to constantly go back and forth and back and forth. So if you have the time and ability to do hand watering, it can be fairly good if you're able to get your hands in the soil and really feel the container and figure out what the level of water is in the soil already. But be cautioned that if you're not getting into the soil on a regular basis, and you might not know exactly how much water your container will need. And like I was mentioned at the beginning, this is a typical way of overwatering your plants. So just be cautious of that system for watering. Okay, and now to consider the soil. This is the best part of container gardening, is that you really control the soil that you put your plants into or your flowers into. And when you're thinking about what soil to create for your container gardening, you want to make sure that whatever you're purchasing or creating yourself has air, moisture retention, drainage, and compaction. And so when you're thinking about air, you want to consider either putting perlite or vermiculite into your soil mixture. These are the little round white balls that you see typically in potting soil from the store, but you can purchase them separately on your own. You can purchase most of these ingredients that I'm going to talk about on their own, and then create your own soil mixture and really control the amounts that you have in each one. So if you're growing something in particular that needs more air or more moisture retention, you might want to add more of one ingredient over the other. So you can really tailor it to the plants that you're growing in your container gardens. So moisture retention, having cocoa coir, coconut fiber. This is a byproduct of the coconut industry. It's a great ingredient to have that moisture hold in the soil. Typically what you'll find in bagged potting soil from the store will contain peat moss. We're trying to encourage people to avoid peat moss. because it is a limited resource that is slow growing. It takes an extremely long time for it to grow, and it is typically unsustainably harvested. So coco coir is a great substitute for that moisture retention, and it is currently a better option than the peat moss because it is already created and it would have otherwise just been disposed of. Thinking about drainage, you want to think about having light and fluffy soil. So something that can drain the water quickly and can go through. You also, when you're thinking about root vegetables to put into your containers, light and fluffy is what you want, because if you think about growing inside of a container, your plants only have that amount of space to grow inside of. So you really want to be able to give them all of that space to move around. If you have roots and rocks inside of your soil, then they have to find their way around those kinds of barriers. But when you're planting in a container, you really want to make it as light and fluffy as possible so the roots and those root vegetables can really grow the way that they need to and maximize the use of the space that they have available to them. And then when you think about compaction, you want to stay away from silt or clay. It has too many minerals and it's too thick. It's the kind of soil that you pick up and you squeeze, water comes out and it sticks together in a ball. It holds water really, really well and will often cause root rot. So you want to stay away from that. So if you're digging soil, like topsoil from your yard, you might find that you actually have a lot of silt and clay, and it might not be the best to be putting into your containers. I remember when I first started, I thought, oh, I could just take any soil, and I did dig from a inconspicuous spot in the yard that I was in, and nothing grew in that container because it didn't have the nutrients available for the plant to really thrive in. And one piece that I like to talk about is that the cost is, it's really cost effective to make your own, beyond the fact that you can really tailor it to the plants that you're growing in your containers. Making your own is a great cost effective way to get into container gardening. And you can also reuse, whether you're purchasing it or making your own, you can reuse your soil each year. The way to revitalize it is to add fertilizer or compost to the soil to bring back those nutrients into the soil so that you can then have another growing season. You do want to be wary though, if you have a plant with a disease, you don't want to be reusing that potting soil because it can cause the next plant that you grow in that soil to catch that disease. So just be aware of that. Are there any questions that are coming up in the chat, Ryan?
Let's see. What are your thoughts about putting plastic bottles or milk cartons in large containers? I thought filling your large containers would make them lighter, so it's easier to move.
So if I'm understanding the question correctly,
Lightening up the containers.
yeah, so the container material that you're using, yeah, you want to consider if you're going to be moving that plant around, you want to be using lighter containers. If you're using plastic as your medium, you want to make sure that it's food safe plastic. So you're like in the video, he showed water bottles, that's a food safe material, but you're not going to be wanting to use a 5-gallon bucket that was used to hold paint or something like that. You want to make sure that it was previously used for food so that you know it won't be leaching any chemicals or anything into your soil. But there are people that have worries about using plastic in the sunlight, especially because it might like degrade the plastics and go into the soil. So that's just kind of on a personal note, how you feel about using plastic in different elements.
I'm going to add something to that.
Yeah.
Notice that as depending on what your plant is, if it's going to grow really tall, you might have to trellis it. Be aware that wind will catch it and it'll act like a sail. So sometimes that weight is important to have at the base. So in your container, depending on the location you have it. And also when the recipe here, the soil that Hannah's kind of describing here, because it's really soilless, and this kind of goes to another question, it doesn't have a lot of really low minerals, so it doesn't compact, it's a lot lighter. So if you use a good potting soil with perlite, vermiculite, and peat moss or coconut coir, it's not going to be as heavy as your ground garden soil or some of the garden soil that you purchase at a local retailer. And that was one of the other questions. Where was it? I bought Cedar Grove compost and garden soil for my containers. Is this too heavy? And I was wanted to kind of share what I think of that one. The garden soil, when you buy products that say garden soil, if you look at the ingredients, they usually contain like a little bit like sand, silt, or clay, so some minerals. So they're going to be heavier, and that will compact, and that can actually stunt some of the growth of the roots, and especially like root crops. But a potting soil, if you look at the ingredients for a potting soil or a bag that's labeled potting soil, it won't have those same ingredients, and it will be kind of this slide that's kind of showing here will be mostly what the ingredients are. So those are can be confusing. You look at all these bags of potting soil and garden soil, and all the names they use to describe them. It's really important to look at the ingredient list.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. And I forgot to introduce you. This is Ryan Misley. He also is a Pierce County environmental educator. Okay. I'm going to move on to fertilizers and nutrients because I think that might answer some of the questions that I was able to see in chat. So fertilizers typically come in this formula, NPK, and the NPK stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. What you'll see on like fertilizer bags are these three numbers. So 16, 16, 16. That lines up with the NPK formula. So it's 16 nitrogen, 16 phosphorus, 16 potassium. And the way that you read this is that a 16, 16, 16 fertilizer has 16% of each nutrient. So if you were to see a bag that said 8, 8, 8, it would just have 8% of each nutrient. So a bag of that 16, 16, 16 contains twice as much fertilizer as the same size bag of 8, 8, 8. The 16, 16, 16 is just more concentrated, but both have the same ratios. So it really depends on how much you're wanting to feed your plant at the time of fertilizing. So with containers, you want to think about feeding your plant only as much as it needs and not overfeeding it, because when you water it, it can leach out the fertilizer onto the ground. And so if you're doing a container gardening on a patio or a balcony, that fertilizer will just run off and into the stream. So you want to be cautious of that, only fertilizing the amount that your individual plant needs, and it really varies on variety. General fertilizers, these all-purpose fertilizers meet most plants' requirements throughout the growing season, but to stimulate root growth and stem vigor, you want to have higher phosphorus and potassium. And then when you're thinking about that lush green growth, so the starting of your growing of the plant, you want to think about how much nitrogen you're feeding your plant. So to encourage that foliage growth, you'll have a higher nitrogen percentage. Whereas if your plant's ready to start fruiting and flowering, growing those roots and stems, you want to add more phosphorus and potassium. Again, it varies by plant, and there's lots of materials out there that will tell you specifically for that plant how much fertilizer you would need depending on the growing period that it's in. A couple of other notes. There's two different types of fertilizers. There's slow release and quick release. Slow release fertilizers are best for containers because that leaching won't happen as much as with quick release. Slow release are granule fertilizers. So things like compost is a slow release fertilizer. Worm castings can also be a slow release fertilizer. Sound Grow, which is a byproduct from our wastewater treatment plant, is also a slow release fertilizer. They're pelletized. So if you look for pelletized fertilizers, those are typically the slower release ones, whereas quick release are liquid soluble nutrients and soil amendments. So they are coming in liquid form. They're easy to apply, usually with your watering system, and that can add fertilizers really quickly to your soil. some DIY fertilizers. So if you're not wanting to purchase fertilizer from the store, I've tried a couple of these, but not all of them, are coffee grounds. They are high in nitrogen content, but they do tend to be acidic. So you want to do it in moderation. If you're a daily coffee drinker, you're not going to want to daily dump your coffee grounds into your containers. You might save a couple cups of it and then sprinkle it around every once in a while, depending on your plant's needs. Eggshells have calcium in them, and that stimulates root growth. Some people also think that eggshells, when you crush them and place them around your plant, can keep slugs at bay. I have yet to see that actually happen, but I was thinking the other day that if you crush them in just the right way with little points, you can place them very nicely around your plant as kind of a fence, and that might help. But yeah, slugs are a hard one in this area. One that I have not done is bone meal, and this can be created on your own through, if you are a meat eater and you have bones, you can boil the bones to get the rest of those ligaments and cartilage off of the bones, and then once all of that stuff has fallen off the bone, you can dry them in your oven, and then with a high-powered blender, you can actually blend them into a dust and then put that around your soil. So it's a creative way of reusing a food scrap that can't easily be dealt with otherwise. It's a great way to reuse an item that would otherwise just go to the landfill. So choosing a container, you want to consider size and depth of the container, cost, aesthetic, durability of the container, weight, stability, and support. So kind of what Ryan was saying about trellises and the lightness of the soil. So when you're thinking about size and depth of your container, it really matters about the depth that you're using. So here you'll see a number of different gallon sizes or container sizes that are good for different types of vegetables. And this is just a short list. This is not by any means comprehensive. But when you're thinking about planting in containers, you always want to start small and then transplant into bigger containers. So you could use a rotating schedule if you're worried about the amount of big pots you actually have available. Start something in smaller containers, use that glass cup or plastic around it to have that greenhouse effect, transfer them into the larger container when they're ready. And then once those are transferred over, wait a couple weeks and then start a new round of crops on a windowsill or wherever you have available to then put into your containers again. Starting seeds in different containers like egg cartons, you can do them in crinkly plastics, the things that berries come in. You can also use plastic cups, or I've seen people even do them in those half boxes, those cardboard boxes that you can sometimes get from Costco, not the larger ones, but the smaller ones. Just cover that in soil, starting soil, and put your seeds in there, and then you can pull them out one by one into the larger pot. The reason that you want to start with a smaller container and transfer into a larger container is because small plants can potentially not do so well with that much space. It can actually make them bolt fairly quickly, or kind of shock them a little bit where their roots don't really know where to go, and they need to have that time to really bind their roots into the smaller container and establish themselves before going into an area where they can really explore and get really big in those containers. When you're planting your container, you want to leave 1 inch of headspace at the top so you don't spill over when watering. And when thinking about the plant, think about how big their foliage is or how deep their root is, and that can give you at least a little bit of a sense of how deep your container needs to be. Tomatoes by far need the largest containers. They need a really good root system to be able to grow. And we'll talk about trellises in a little bit, but there's a piece to that on trellises and tomatoes. But first, we want to talk about cost, aesthetic, and durability. So again, terracotta, it breathes, so it can over dry the soil. It leaches that water so it can over dry the soil. In winter, it can absorb too much water and actually crack. So if you're growing throughout the year, you want to consider that terracotta might not be the best material for you. They do look really pretty though, so they can have purpose in that way. Cast concrete is a long-lasting solution that comes in a variety of styles and sizes and can be left out in all winter. The only problem is it's extremely heavy. So if you're thinking about moving your container around, you probably want to avoid cast concrete. Plastic and fiberglass pots are really lightweight and they're fairly inexpensive. And they also come in a variety of shapes and sizes. So it could be a good option if you're planting on a patio that maybe you're renting a place and you might need to move those pots later on. It's a great solution for that. Also, containers that are made of polyurethane foam can weigh up to 90% less than terracotta or concrete containers, and they also can look pretty similar to terracotta and concrete containers. So if you're looking for that aesthetic, but not necessarily wanting the weight of that container, this is a great option. They also resist chipping and cracking and can insulate roots against both hot and cold temperatures. So they're a really good they're a really good choice for potting up plants that will stay outside year round. You can also do cloth pockets or wall pockets. So these are things that you can hang on a wall and just put in your plants into the individual pockets. You can create, like we saw in the video, you can create hanging series of bottles for planting inside. Because those are much smaller, you want to think about what you're actually planting in there, what will thrive and survive in that small amount of space. Also, cloth bags can tend to dry out quickly, so you want to make sure to have a good watering system for them. And repurposing materials. If you are new to this and you just want to try it out, go for what's already available to you. Using those crinkly plastics or the boxes that like baby spinach comes in is a great starting point for some of growing baby spinach or growing baby lettuces even. You can use wooden pallets or milk jugs, soda bottles, or tubs. You can even use toilets, I've seen, typically for flowers, so they make more of an aesthetic appeal for people's yards. But again, you only want to use any plastics that are safe for storing food. So the food safe plastic, it's plastic type number 4. So if you're looking through the plastics that you have in your recycling bin, you just want to make sure, did I use this for food? And if you're not sure where it came from, plastic type number 4 is a good bet. You can also get food safe gallon tubs from a local grocer or baker. If you ask them if they have any tubs that held like sour cream or frosting in it, those are great ways to reuse items that either would have been recycled or landfilled. And oftentimes they don't mind holding them off to the side for you because it just takes them off their hands. They're not having to use the recycling or landfill space for these tubs. Things you want to avoid when you're reusing materials are anything that has flaking metal on it or chemically treated wood. A lot of people are really excited about using wooden pallets for growing or building garden beds even. You just want to make sure that it hasn't been treated before. And typically there's like a sign on the side that has a marker that tells you if it's been chemically treated or not.
Hey, Hannah,
Yes.
Go back to that last slide. There's a question on the bottom center. What's that picture of?
This one right here?
Yeah.
Is plastic bottles. So they're lengthwise, they're horizontal, and it looks like the side has been cut out. So you can plant inside of the plastic bottle that way. And then they use both ends of the bottle to tie rope around to create that chain. So they're long and connected.
Vertical
Great.
garden out of soda bottles. Awesome.
Yeah. Okay, weight, stability, support. You need to consider the weight of your growth. So when you're growing trellising plants, you want to have a trellis in there, but make sure that you have a heavy pot below that will hold not only the trellis and the plant, but hold the soil in place especially if you have wind coming through your area, which on a day like today, it was pretty windy in my area at least. And it can cause havoc on your container plants if you haven't considered the height of your plants. You also want to make sure that any vining plants aren't growing on the ground. So think ahead. If you're growing beans or peas or anything like that, you want to make sure that they have something to grow on, so you're not having to vine them up later. It's much easier if they have that already to grow on, so you're not having to kind of manipulate the plant later on. And if they do end up being on the ground or too close together, it can cause the vegetables to rot. So you just want to make sure there's airflow and that they have a place to grow that allows them to grow up. Again, think about the wind. Make sure that you know how much wind that area is going to get, and that your plant that you put a trellis on has that stability on the bottom. And think about how you can repurpose stuff to create trellises too. The one on the far right is just willow branches that they've tied together at the top. So if you have a willow tree or another tree that has really strong branches, you can actually just stick them in the pot and then tie them off at the top. And then you can use bike tubes and wheels as a trellis. So this one here has one on top and one down below, and they've just strung ropes all along it for what looks like peas to grow up onto. This one has some skis on there. Oftentimes you can find some rough skis in Goodwill, or maybe you have a friend who has way too many skis that they don't actually need anymore. Who knows? But you can use those and connect them at the top and just run line between the two of them as well. This one got creative with PVC piping and just allowed their plant to grow down in the container. It looks like this is probably a squash plant. It grows up into the trellis and then down on both sides. So get creative. They can make beautiful accent pieces to your yard, to a sidewalk, to a patio or a balcony space as well. Now, finally, we'll get to designing your garden. So thinking about plant considerations, and then general management, schedule, and routine. So when you're thinking about what plants you want to actually be growing, you want to think about what it is that you actually like to eat. Are you going to grow something that's going to be eaten? We get excited about planting stuff, and then we might overplant. So you want to think about how much space you have available and how much of the plant you actually want to be eating. So with those two in mind, you can really plan out how many tomato plants you actually want, how many basil plants you want, how many beans or pea plants you want, and also make sure to be aware of their growing season, because some plants will take longer, that they'll need longer to grow in the container. And if you're doing a succession planting, you want to make sure that you're aware of how long those beans needed in the container before you've already started your start of basil, for example, and wanting to plant that in there. So you just want to make sure that you understand the schedule of your planting. And finally, how adventurous are you feeling? Maybe you want to try something new this year. Maybe you want to dedicate 1 or 2 containers to something you've never grown before. I highly encourage it, because the way that I approach gardening is it's all an experiment. Oftentimes we fail at gardening, and that's totally okay. It's part of the learning process. If you fail, you're going to learn something. And so by trying something new out, a variety you haven't had before, or a plant you never thought you could grow in the growing space that you have, it allows you to learn things about that plant, so that if you do move or you do have new space available to you, you can try it again with more confidence. So thinking also if it will be viable in the space that you have. This goes along with being adventurous. So they kind of work against each other, but you want to be aware of what can actually grow in your space successfully. And then the adventurous part is maybe trying something to figure out if you can manipulate the growing conditions to make it viable. And then when you're choosing your plants, you want to think about the right plant in the right place with the right pot. So having those 3 considerations will help you find success in growing in your containers. And you can interplant, you can plant things together. So make sure that those plants in the same container have the same needs and they have complementary habits. Maybe they need to be fertilized at the same time. Maybe they need to have the same amount of water. Really think about what those plants will need and if they'll do good together. And then also think about, do they look good together? Because you want to have an attractive garden as much as it is fun to just eat the vegetables. It's also fun to look at, and it makes you feel more connected to those plants if you're finding joy in just looking at them as well. You can do succession planting. So like I was saying, making sure that you have that plan for planting that next crop inside of your container at the right time. So you haven't started your seed or purchased a start too early and you're having to hold on to that container or hold on to that plant in the starting container too long before planting it into the container that it can grow in. So making sure that you have that schedule tied down if you're doing some succession planting. And finally, this is a design element that I find challenging for myself to accomplish. I don't think I have the design eye for it, but it is really cool when you see it successfully done, is the thriller filler spiller. This is something where in the container, you have something that's really thrilling to look at, and then you have something that's filling in the gaps, and then you have something that's spilling out the side, all in one container, all working together to not only make food or bring in pollinators, but to just look beautiful too on your patio. So when you're looking at the different seed varieties available to you, there are quite a lot. These are some examples of different seed companies that you can look at for seeds. These ones in particular have container specific varieties. Sometimes they'll say patio varieties, sometimes they'll say container varieties or grows well in containers. These are all key words that you want to be looking for when looking through seed catalogs or seed websites. There are a ton of options, and more seed companies are starting to breed container varieties where they have carrots that are shorter that can grow in smaller pots. They have beets that can be kind of interplanted together and they grow really well together in a smaller space. So a lot of the varieties of plants for containers also don't need a large amount of spacing. They can be kind of grouped in together. And in this picture too, you'll see this lettuce, it's not growing to a full head of lettuce. This is just a cutting lettuce where you can have baby lettuce and harvest from it multiple times. So that is a really good way to maximize the amount of food coming out of a container rather than waiting the long period of time it does to really cultivate that full head of lettuce. You're able to get a couple of cuttings of this baby lettuce for your salads or however you eat them pretty continuously. Some other plants that work well are pole beans, carrots, cucumbers, eggplants, green onions, again, lettuce and salad greens, peppers, radishes, summer squash, and tomatoes. There are so many more. I really like growing carrots in containers. And I've also grown asparagus in containers, which I never thought would work out, but they actually did once I was patient and had to wait a couple years for them to really come up nice and thick stalks. So it's really exciting to see what you can grow in containers. So I really encourage you to be adventurous and also just be aware of the different varieties available to you for container gardening specifically. Okay, now we're going to do some activities for you all. We're going to give you some time to use your brain and think about how you can reuse these typically recycled items to use it as a container garden. So we have a milk jug, a salad box, and a container of cashews. I'd like you to take, 5 minutes and think to yourself, what could I do with this? How could it fit in my space? What would I grow in it? How much sun would it need to thrive? Do I have an area in mind that I would already place it? And then what kind of care or maintenance would I need to tend to for it to be successful? So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing for a second. I'm gonna copy those into the chat. And then I'm going to give you all 5 minutes. And I'll share my screen again so you can see the pictures of it. Go ahead and take the next 5 minutes to just jot down ideas. You can even draw. What do you think you could do with these typically recycled or typically thrown out containers or recycled containers? Great, I see some people in the chat talking about how they would use stuff. Feel free to continue that conversation. We also have enough time if people want to unmute and talk about how they would use their these containers for growing. We can do that as well. Yeah, lots of seeds starting for the middle one. I've definitely used the bigger salad containers for growing baby lettuce. It's a great way, especially if you just have a windowsill, it's a great way to grow baby lettuce, potentially year round if you have the right growing conditions. Yeah, using the milk jug as a cloche for seedlings, definitely. It could definitely provide that same greenhouse effect of letting light in, protecting it from bugs too, potentially, depending on how big your plant is. I've also seen the milk jugs cut right here to use as a scoop for soil. So if you don't have a scoop that's fairly big, it's much easier to use a milk gallon or milk jug to pour in your soil into your container rather than what I have been doing for many years is just using my hands and dumping it in one at a time. All right, I'm gonna keep going. Feel free to keep dropping your ideas in the chat if you want to. But before I move on, is there anybody that wants to share out to the group ways that they would use any of these containers? All right. So we are at the end of our session. We have a lot of information. We'll open it up. We'll be sending out this information as class notes at the end, probably tomorrow or the next day. I don't actually send the email, so it'll probably be tomorrow or the next day. And we also have a survey to an evaluation that we would love for you to fill out so that we can continue to make these sessions better and better for you. So Ryan, would you drop the link into the chat? And then what we'll do next is just open it up for questions for people if I missed anything in the chat that didn't get addressed.
Oh, I'm not prepared for that link.
Okay, I got you.
Oh wait, I think I have it.
Sharing, and then I got it.
Got it, thanks.
Okay, so there's the link to the survey. Please fill it out. You can even take this time since we finished a little early to fill it out. And then, yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or drop it into chat, whichever you feel most comfortable with.
I answered a question from Bob about tomatoes. And I described one of my answers was that there's a determinate and indeterminate kind of growth types of tomatoes, and they're listed on the seed packet. I'm not sure if you bought starts, so these are tomato starts from say like Home Depot or a nursery. I'm gonna assume that the label would tell you if they're determinate or indeterminate. What that means is indeterminate will continue to grow until the first frost, and then they won't produce any fruit. The determinate will grow to a certain size. It'll produce lots of flowers, and then those are pollinated. And usually the determinate doesn't produce as long. It's like a higher volume in a lower amount of time. And so that's what I was thinking, since there's some splitting and due to rain, the determinate one, especially in a container, would ripen and you'd have your harvest sooner in the season or sooner in the summer. But I just like the answer. Check, how do I know if it's determinate or not? Check the seed packet, but I'm gonna suspect that most labels will say determinate and indeterminate if you're buying starts, but you might find that it doesn't say that, which is unfortunate because that's important to know.
Any other questions or thoughts about pieces of the workshop, something we didn't address that you'd love to hear more about?
I was trying to do my best to respond to all the questions as I could.
Thanks, Ryan. Diseased soil, what could be done with it? So when you have diseased soil, Ryan, I'm curious what you have done with